evening, everybody. For our next session, if you've had the pleasure of learning either with Rabbi Grover or with me for our first session, our second session, we wanted to bring you something that was a little more of a conversation. It's always been one of my pet peeves when people say Judaism says X or Y or Z or anything, because we're a 4,000-year-old tradition and there is a lot of different material and a lot of nuance within it. And I think there is a multitude of views that one could call Jewish. So in that spirit, we're tonight having a conversation about the issue of triage, which is obviously a relevant issue. How do you pick lives that matter more than others? Do some lives matter more than others? I think was the controversial title we tried to pick for the class. But the idea is to examine that question with different sources and see different perspectives within our tradition. And hopefully at the end, if I'm successful.
At the end, is everyone going to vote for who they think is right?
When we did Rabbi versus Rabbi with Rabbi Walker, we didn't vote on that. We voted on, did you learn something new?
Oh, okay.
So, instead of that, but I'm happy to compete on who's right, except for, right, I didn't pick my topic because it's necessarily the one I agree with.
That's right.
Because it was the opposite of the one you picked. I know I shouldn't say this, but there's not a lot that I think that the Catholic Church did right, but they have an official position, or they did, in the olden days of sainthood called the Advocatus Diaboli, which is the devil's advocate, somebody that was appointed by the church to argue the opposite. So that's what I'm doing tonight. I'm arguing the opposite of what Rabbi Grover is arguing, but I think there's good basis in our sources for that. Rabbi, do you have anything you'd like to add to our beginning? I think you get the first comment.
I'm looking forward to beating you.
It's not a contest. It is an educational opportunity.
Okay.
You've already lost if you think it's a contest.
Who wants to do the first source, me or you?
You do the first one. I'm going to unscale.
Okay, so my side is some lives matter more than others. Okay, that's what I'm going to be arguing. And the first I'm going to bring forth 4 arguments. The first argument I'm going to make is that your life matters more than the lives of others. Your life matters more than the life of another. Let's take a look. Excuse me. Sharing the wrong screen with you. Let's take a look at this source from the Talmud. If 2 people were walking on a desolate path, and there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them, and if both drink from the jug, both will die. But if only one of them drinks, he will reach a settled area. So does everyone understand? This is sort of it's a hypothetical scenario. 2 people, but 1 jug. If they both drink from the jug, they'll both die because there's only so much water in the jug. But there's enough for 1 person to keep 1 person alive. So what did Ben Petora teach? That both of them should drink, a half for you, and they both die. Why? Let neither one of them see the death of the other. So Ben Petora's view is it's too painful to force somebody to watch the death of her fellow, and therefore we make them sort of both, we take the guilt away from both of them. So neither of them will feel like they're responsible, like he or she is responsible for the death of her friend, and they both drink, and if they both die, then they both die. But so this was accepted. That would have been an argument for Rabbi Sachs. But then it says this was accepted until Rabbi Akiva came and taught the verse, and your brother shall live with you. V'chai achicha imach. So since it says your brother shall live with you, it indicates that your life takes precedence over the life of another. V'chai achicha imach comes from the Torah, It means your brother lives with you, but it's another way of saying your life comes first. So here we are on the desert island. There's only one bottle of water to drink. If Rabbi Sachs is with me on the desert island, I'm sorry. The water, I have a moral responsibility, according to Rabbi Akiva, to drink it myself.
It's a very interesting point, Rabbi, except I don't think that source is actually quite as strong as you think it is. I mean, as you pointed out, there is right in it somebody who disagrees with you, but it's true, they're not the main accepted opinion, right? We go with the other opinion. But the key difference here isn't that one life matters more than the other, but that you don't have to sacrifice your own life to save somebody else. It's your water bottle. It's not that there's a water jug on the island and you beat me to death so that you can have it. It's your water bottle. And you don't have to give up your life to save mine. But if that water bottle didn't belong to you, you don't get to come take my water bottle. That wouldn't be okay, right? That would say that your life is more valuable than my life. But that's not what the source says. It says instead that you don't have to give your own life up. And what I want to show for that is actually a source from Mishnah Ohalot. And it says, if a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and brings it forth limb by limb. Apologize, it's not dinner material. Because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, right? She'ein dochi nefesh bibnei nefesh. For one may not set aside one person's life for that of another, right? Here you have a case where when the fetus is still in the womb and is still dependent on the mother to survive, the mother's life takes precedence. But the moment that child becomes viable on their own and is emerged forth and is no longer relying on the mother to breathe and all of that, their two lives are equal. You cannot intervene taking either life to save the other. The mother cannot intervene and take the baby out to save herself, and vice versa. The baby can't decide, I'm going to take the mother out. Not just that they can't physically, but they're not allowed to. And again, the idea being, yours doesn't say that your own life is more important than somebody else's, only that you don't sacrifice your life for somebody else's. But you cannot pick and choose your life over another person's, and our tradition is very, very clear on that. She'ein dochi nefesh mipei nefesh. Case closed. Everyone can go home. Happy Shavuot.
Just a second there before you say case is closed. I have another source here that says that source is wrong, because there are some cases where saving one person's life might come at the cost of the lives of the rest of the community. Here's the next source I want to share with everybody. It talks about the importance of the community's well-being coming first. The Mishnah says, captives are not redeemed for more than their monetary value for the betterment of the world. So a long time ago, Jews used to be captured and taken prisoner, and whoever captured them would demand a certain sum of money ransom. The problem is, if the amount of money was too high and people were paying it, it would encourage these kidnappers to kidnap everybody else in the community too, as many people as possible, so you can profit more and more. But the Mishnah, which is a more important source than the one you cited, Rabbi Sachs, says that is not, that is very problematic. And so if somebody, even you, Rabbi Sachs, are held captive by an evil person and the bail is too much money, I shouldn't pay it, because it'll only encourage other associate rabbis like you to get captured. There's another similar source that teaches the same thing. This one actually came up in discussions about how to handle triage during the pandemic, because one of the questions raised in the pandemic is whether to give everybody a first shot or to give certain people 2 shots and let everybody else wait their turn. What was the best way to allocate the vaccines? And this source that I'm going to share with you now was used to support the well-being of the community rather than any individual. A spring belonging to the residents of a city, if the water was needed for their own lives and it was also needed for the lives of others, their own lives take precedence over the lives of others. This is really tricky. Now, what this is saying is that our policy of vaccines, right, which says let's first vaccinate the people in our own country before taking care of people who live in other countries, actually has some grounding within the Mishnah. Excuse me, that's not the Mishnah. It was in the Dharma, is in the Talmud. It's like a spring that you have that's sufficient for the people in your city, but not sufficient to share with everybody in the rest of the world. You take care of the people in your own city first. Likewise, if the water was needed for their own animals and for the animals of others, their own animals take precedence over the animals of others. And if their own laundry and the laundry of others, their own laundry takes precedence over the laundry of others. However, if for the lives of others and their own laundry, the lives of others take precedence over their own laundry. Rabbi Yossi disagrees and says even their own laundry takes precedence over the lives of others. Now, maybe some of you think Rabbi Yossi goes too far, but the principle is my stuff, the community stuff, before the welfare of the community, before the welfare of other communities. Rabbi Yossi says, even if it's your laundry that you need the water for, but the people in Ottawa need your spring for their own, to drink for their own well-being, tough. It's your spring. You can do what you want with it. I'm sorry, Rabbi Sachs, that's a pretty, I think, closed case kind of source for subverting the interests of any individual to the welfare of your own community.
All right, let me, spotlighted. All right, I think you're right that those sources are very, very strong, but I'm going to give an attempt. I'm going to do it out of order, though, okay? If everyone will bear with me, and I'll try to remember all the points that you made. The first one is the laundry point, because if you keep going in the sugya, right, even their own laundry takes precedence over the lives of others. The Gemara goes on because they question that, and they say, how can that be? And they go to this idea of, at least as far as they're concerned, it's a health thing. It's not just one's pleasure, one's ability to have clean clothes, but it's out of medical fear. It's out of fear that the dirty clothes is going to lead to serious pain and injury, right? They get into this argument over grime on one's head leads to blindness and grime on one's clothes lead to madness. So they're talking about a real medical issue here going on rather than just having a nice, clean shirt, not having a coffee stain on it. So I want to make that distinction that they're not saying in the Gemara, even that extremist position, that your stuff takes precedence over someone else's life. But again, that same idea of your first concern is for your own medical needs and then someone else's. You don't have to give up your life to help someone else. I don't think that source really gets you further than your initial source, but we'll on the jug of water, but we'll keep looking at it.
So what you're saying is that the Americans were correct to give us AstraZeneca, but not correct to give us any Pfizer.
I'm saying in the academic abstract rather than any specific sock.
Mm-hmm.
As the associate rabbi, I'm not the Mara d'Atra to make such sock decisions.
But you are the only American rabbi.
As for the idea of the other town and all of that, right? We have this great source from Mishnah Torah, where he tells us afilu ha'akum, even with regard to non-Jews, our sages have commanded us to visit their sick and bury their dead along with the Jewish dead and sustain their poor along with the poor of Israel for the sake of peace. Right? We have this idea of pursuing peace and that we have to make peace with those around us. So, in with that first part of it, that you can choose your stuff over the stuff of the neighboring city, that your community comes first. Maybe it's a non-Jewish city over there. We're going to protect Jews first, right? I think that's how you categorize that one, is community comes first. But that's a dangerous game to play when you're a minority group, because in any democratic nation where people get to vote on which person we're going to protect, who we're going to give the medical resources based on whether they're a community or not, 99 times out of 100, we're going to be the minority. We're not going to be the community that's picked. So I think we can put ourselves with a little bit of John Rawls' idea of being behind the veil of ignorance. If we were deciding a society, what criteria would we choose, not knowing which part of society we were going to be in when it came to whose life comes first, picking by community is a really hard one to do. And the last point Rabbi Grover made, which is really the first point, was this idea of the many before the few. If you indulge me, I know actually this is coming in relation to your next source, so it's good to maybe have it now too. But this is also from Mishnah Torah. I'm going to share, but Rambam's quoting here. He's citing the Gemara is what he's bringing up here in this source. And this is about rules of what should you do rather than what should you, right? Pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat. You can break almost any mitzvah for the sake of saving a life, right? You can break Shabbat if your life's in danger. You can break kashrut. You can break all sorts of things. But there are 3 crimes you have to give up your life for: adultery, idolatry, and murder, right? You cannot sacrifice someone else's life for your own. And the example given is this classic case. Should heathens demand of Israelites to give up one for execution on threat that they will kill all if they refuse? They must sooner submit that they are all put to death rather than deliver up one body of Israel, right? Saving the majority, the whole town, doesn't make it okay to give up one person for death if that means, right, that even if the whole town will be saved by that act. You cannot kill one person to save the many, right? The needs of the many do not outweigh the needs of the few. We are not Vulcans. We are Jews, and Judaism is very clear on this issue. The only exception being if somebody's been signaled out as an individual, as in the case of Sheba and Bikri, who is in the story of King David. It's a story for another day, right? But unless somebody's already singled out for death, you cannot pick somebody else to be sacrificed, even if it's saving 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, 100 people, 100,000 people. Judaism's very clear on that, Rabbi. So I'll give it over to you to try again, but I don't think you've gotten there yet.
No, I think I have gotten there, because I have from the Minchat Chinuch, Rabbi Yosef Babad of Galicia. He speaks specifically about your case in Maimonides, Rabbi Sachs, the case of somebody being singled out for death, and how is the community to respond. Look what he says. It seems to me, in the case where Gentiles demand selecting and handing over one person in order to save the group, if one of them is terminally ill, they may hand him over, as this person is really not classified as a nefesh. A nefesh is, you might say, a full-spirited person, and therefore the usual logic does not apply, for certainly the other people's blood is redder, and killing such a person is not considered an act of murder. So while you can say, Rabbi Sachs, that Maimonides was speaking about the obligation of the community in a general sense, the Minchat Chinuch gives a specific example where the community has the ability to hand over somebody who's already very sick, terminally ill. And if that's the case, well, why wouldn't I hand that person over rather than somebody who is younger and in much better shape and has a greater chance to live a longer time. Now, this is a really important source for triage, isn't it? Because when you have limited resources and you need to make a distinction, where do those limited resources go to? It seems that this source from the Minchas Chinuch gives us permission to look after the needs of the person with the greatest chance of survival. The healthiest person gets whatever limited resource that is.
So I want to ask you there to clarify for me a bit, because I'm reading that not as the healthiest person, but the person with the longest chance to live. Somebody that's terminally ill, don't waste resources on someone who only has 6 months or a year left, when there's only enough between that person and somebody that has a long life ahead. Is that fair to categorize as that? But this is talking about the length of one's life is what matters?
Yes, and somebody who's already very sick. I'll give you that.
Right? Someone who's terminally ill. Death is a sure thing. Is that safe to say? Death is in their future, whether it's a week, a month, a year, death is in their future.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, case closed.
What do you mean case closed? Case closed with what?
Let me get to my rebuttal here, and you'll see where. 2 different sources. First, Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim. Even if they find a person crushed and it's known that they can only live a few hours more, you break the laws of Shabbat and you do all of this, even if they only have a few hours of life left, right? It's not the final hammer blow. I'll give you that, Rabbi. But our tradition, while we do have that source that you had about the idea of how long someone's life is, we have other sources that tell us that life is precious no matter what. You break Shabbat, you desecrate any of the other except those 3 mitzvot to save a life, even if a person has very limited time. And I want to go to an even more...
That's a ridiculous source, Rabbi Sachs. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's...
You will anyway.
But yes, I will. But that source doesn't talk about having to choose between 2 people. You're choosing between a person and violating Shabbat, which is a very different moral question than having limited resources, only the resources available to treat one person, and having the choice of somebody who's well and somebody who's terminally ill.
Great. All I would say is, right, we saw the original source. It's somebody who's selected to die. It's a modern invention, that responsum you found, where that interpretation that it's talking about the illness has selected somebody, right? It's a bit of a stretch for the original one. But I want to say is that while I don't have something that says your source of this one rabbi that you've quoted is wrong, but that we have multiple competing values here. And I want to say that the length of life, even very short, really, really matters, because we get this from Bava Kama. And this is a hypothetical example. I don't think they really did this ever. It ever came up. But Rabbi says, in the case of throwing a child from the rooftop, one person throws a child off the rooftop and somebody else comes and catches it on the end of their sword. There's a difference of opinion between Rabbi Judah ben Batra and the rabbis. For it was in the case of 10 persons beating one to death with 10 sticks, whether simultaneously or consecutively, none of them is guilty of murder. Rabbi Judah ben Batra says if consecutively, the last person is liable, for they were the immediate cause of death. Right? So from this example of a bunch of people are hitting somebody, are any of them individually liable for murder? And the answer is the last person to do it. And that goes then for Rabbi Judah ben Batra, that even if somebody else, if Rabbi Grover were to throw a baby off a roof, right? I know it's a hard stretch of the imagination that he would do such a thing, but if he were to throw a baby off a roof, if I come along and catch that baby on my sword, I am now guilty of murder, even though that baby didn't have 10 months to live, 6 months, didn't have a week or a day. That baby had, 8 feet left to live. That baby had seconds left on its life. But I am guilty of murder now if I catch that baby on the sword, because I ended those 3 seconds. Every second of life is precious. Every second of life is of value in our tradition. And you don't pick who lives or dies based on how long they have. You found one source that says that, but that's not the overarching idea in our tradition that you get to judge one's life. Point in fact, how do we approach end of life issues? Right? We don't allow euthanasia in our tradition for those very reasons. That even a life that's painful, even a life where a person prefers death, is sacred. And we don't make those kinds of choices.
Again, all your arguments are ridiculous, again, because you're not dealing with the question at hand. You're talking about the sacredness of life, which I accept, but the reality of the situation is not choosing between death and life. It's two people that are in front of you, and you have to choose one of them to die and one of them to live. And the two sources you mentioned are not coming from that perspective. There's a baby maybe that's getting thrown off a roof, but there's another baby that's going to live because that baby, landed on your sword. So I would ask you, Rabbi Sachs, to pay attention to what we're really trying to learn today, and not pull out sources simply because they're the ones and you think they make a broader statement about the value of life. That's a point that I don't disagree with. To treat the actual topic of hand, we have to compare the value of one life with another. And I've already shown this esteemed congregation that the value of the community's life is more important than the life of a person, that your life is more important than somebody else's life, that the life of your community is more important than the life of somebody in somebody else's community. And now I want to show you that, and that somebody who's going to die, their life is less important than somebody who's got a long life ahead of them. And now I'm going to show you.
Before we jump to the next, since we're a little bit ahead of time, can we talk about this a little bit longer?
I want to do my last source and then you can talk. The last point I want to make is that some people are more important than other people and more worthy of saving. This isn't necessarily my point of view, but this is a real source from the Mishnah that makes that point.
No. You don't get to say it's not your point of view. You just crucified me for what's not my view. So this is your view. This is Rabbi Grover wrote this source. He believes in it. He's sewing a throw pillow with this on it.
A man takes precedence over a woman in matters concerning the saving of life. A priest takes precedence over a Levite over an Israelite, and an Israelite over a mamzer. When is this so? When all these were in other respects equal. However, if the mamzer was a scholar and the high priest was an ignoramus, the scholar mamzer takes precedence over the ignorant high priest. So we're dealing here with the actual case at hand. Different people in front of you, limited resources, who gets treatment and who doesn't. And the Mishnah says, it seems to me, that the senior rabbi gets treatment ahead of the associate rabbi. Even though the senior rabbi may be a mamzer, it's still, my title makes me worthy of getting the treatment.
Unless he's an ignoramus, though, I think was what the source ended on. All right. I think that's a great source you have there. It's a very strong one for picking, right? Some people are more valuable than other people, right? That's what that source says. And I will rely on, as you said, this esteemed congregation, their wisdom, their knowledge, to recognize and join me in recognizing how ridiculous that statement is. How can you pick one life as more valuable than another? That shows, that source stands out at how just out there this position is in terms of picking life. Obviously, there are necessities. There are situations where there are limited supplies and we have to make bad choices, but it doesn't make, or difficult choices, but it doesn't always mean that that's the moral choice. It might mean it's the most moral of the options we have available. But you don't get to pick whose life is worth more because of their status or their position or their job title. because I think it's very clearly a law written by rabbis. This is the same people that bring you a law that if your father loses an item and your rabbi loses an item, whose item do you have to bring to first? Your rabbi. It's very clear that the rabbis who wrote this were a little self-indulgent in their legal reasoning. And I'm going to try to step beyond that with a couple other sources. From Mishnah Sanhedrin, it was for this reason humanity was created from a single individual, to teach you that scripture considers anyone who destroys a single life as if they have destroyed an entire world. And scripture considers anyone who saves a single life as if they have saved an entire world. Right? We see this again in the Mishnah Torah, I'm quoting here, but this is what from the Sanhedrin. In a capital case, this is the warning they would give to witnesses about why they had to be very careful and sure of their testimony. Regarding Cain, it is written, right? Demei achicha, your brother's bloods, plural, demei, cry out to me. And that is his blood and the blood of his potential descendants. Right? For this reason, Adam was created alone to show that anyone who destroys a single life are called to account as if they destroyed an entire world. So we have two different teachings here about the infinite sacredness that's in each and every person. Because when you're judging that person as just a lowly ignoramus, what value does that person have to society? Why would I waste vaccine on them? Why would I waste a ventilator on them? You're not just cutting them off. You're who they are in that moment. You're cutting off who they might be tomorrow. How many great ideas, scholars, how many artists, how many people have contributed to society at a later point in life? Right? You're saying that at some point in someone's life, you can judge what they're going to accomplish for the rest of their life, what their value to humanity is, to the community is. I mean, that to me is pretty ridiculous. Forgetting, what about their offspring? You're saying now that you're cutting off worlds of people of contribution based off of your judgment of how much someone's worth. And I don't think that's a judgment any of us are equipped to make. Obviously, there are situations where there are limited resources, difficult decisions have to be made. But our tradition recognizes those are exactly what they are. Those are difficult decisions that can be guided. But there is no answer that one life matters more than another. Because the truth is, our tradition is very, very clear. It doesn't matter how long you have left. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not Jewish. It doesn't matter if you're a scholar or like my esteemed colleague, an ignoramus. Your life is of equal value. Thank you, Rabbi. Please don't fire me.
All right. Well, thank you, Rabbi Sachs. So should we break character now and give our sense of how we come to these sources as professionals?
Sure. So I tried to add you a spotlight. Here we go. So we can both be on screen.
Okay. I think what you've done in your sources is established one of the most important values of the Torah. Actually, I think it might be the fundamental value of the Torah, which is that all lives are equal in their value, that each person is created in the image of God, that we have a responsibility to protect the sacredness of every single life whenever we have the chance to do so. And I think that it's such a fundamental concept to me, and one that I'm thinking about a lot, obviously, in the past few days, because the major assault that's being launched against Israel and its supporters today is that value is not important to us. I mean, what we're seeing on the streets is Jews attack babies, and this is not just an attack on Israel to me, but it is an assault on a fundamental Jewish notion that's almost at the root of everything else, which is why I react to it, I guess, with such tremendous offense. So I think that your presentation today, Rabbi Sachs, could not have been more timely, because you're showing everybody here on this call that whether it's in a triage assessment at a hospital or whether the IDF is making assessments about civilian casualties when it launches an operation, the guiding principle is to protect as much civilian life in particular as is possible. That That said, I think that even though that is sort of the fundamental underlying value, what I try to do is complicate things a little bit with my sources and say that in the real world, sometimes you can't operate like that. Every country has to make, I forget who said this quote, but somebody, it may have been Soloveitchik, who said it
We're
was.
just talking about this over Shabbat.
Was it you?
It was Soloveitchik who said it. I was quoting, but yeah, it's
shared with everybody because I read it after Shabbat.
There's a great talk someone sent me, an old recording of Rav Soloveitchik, and he's talking about during the founding of Israel in the early years. He's talking about how most European countries have a very bloody history, and that now it's impossible to say that we would have been any different because we just didn't have power. We can't claim that we were more ethical than those countries because we weren't in a position. And Israel's really that experiment where we get to see, as Jews now with political power, what that means and what we're going to do with that for the first time in 2,000 years. But he goes on to say that as far as he's concerned, inherent in the definition of a country, there is a loss of ethics. Once you have to start caring about these people more than others, that you're going to have to make those kinds of difficult decisions. Do Americans get vaccines first before Canadians because I'm president of America? Right? Or whatever that is, that you have to make those kinds of very tough decisions.
I read that piece, Rabbi Sachs, over the weekend. I found the quote. It wasn't exactly that, but more or less it was. That's what Soloveitchik was submitting, that now that Jews have power, they have a country of their own. The kind of texts that you brought forward are less relevant because those are texts from La La Land, where every life is equal and you look out for everybody and you visit. Countries have limited resources. There are people who are citizens to whom a country owes much more, and there are people who are foreigners and outsiders to whom a country owes much less. And Jews are now called upon, now that we have a country of our own, to make those difficult moral decisions and have to decide with limited resources who gets and who does not get. And my sources are there to sort of muddy the waters and bring forth the idea that actually there is support in Jewish sources for choosing some people over others. The kinds of, where we draw the line on who gets priority is worked out by rabbinic, experts and medical experts too. But the idea that there are priorities, I think, has a very solid grounding in Jewish law, because limited resources are just a part of life, and you can't visit everybody in the hospital, and you can't treat everybody equally, and your spring does not have enough water to feed everybody in every town, and your jug doesn't have enough water to support me and to support you. That's the real world. And in the real world, triage is a thing. And I think the Torah gives us some helpful ground rules to realize those.
I think the important thing to note, though, right, like you said, that's parts the Torah and parts the rabbis, and we have these sources that are very much reflective of a time and place, right, where men take precedence over women, where a scholar over an ignoramus. But we have these sources that are, in a lot of ways, I don't know that they necessarily reflect divine truth. Not saying that there aren't ones in there that you show that do, but other ones that seem to me much more of a product of the authorship and their own kind of human intuition or error, I might say, their own frame of reference and prejudices.
Right.
But for me, one of the interesting things is, much like you said, right, that the reality is that life isn't perfect, right? We don't have this la la land. And that's one of the problem with different theories of ethics that I've always studied and struggled with. People often characterize Judaism and other religions as a deontological form, that this is the answer and it's this all the time, versus the idea of consequentialism, that sometimes the consequences the ends do justify the means. The consequences matter, right? Saving 100 people, it's okay to kill one person, versus if you believe killing is always wrong, It's not okay to kill one person to save 100 or 1,000 or 10,000. And neither of those really work in reality. And that's one of the things I love about Jewish ethics is that it really blends the two together. We have both deontological sources and both consequentialist sources. We don't end up in some crazy places that other theories of ethics do, where you have um, Kant famously had the example, right? Lying is always wrong. So someone runs into your house and says, "Please hide me. There's a man with an axe trying to kill me." And a minute later, somebody else knocks on the door with an axe and says, "Is there a girl hiding in here?" Kant says you're morally forbidden to lie because lying is always wrong no matter what, right? And that is ludicrous to our intuitions for a reason. That it's ludicrous to think that. But at the same time, there are things that are always right and wrong. And I think our tradition does a good job blending those two, the consequences along with those values. But it's a struggle. At the end of the day, these are difficult choices. And sometimes it's the better of two bad options that we have to choose.
So how do you evaluate some of the choices based on the sources that we've been learning, some of the sources that we've made as a country with regards to handling the limited resources that we have? Or do you not want to comment?
I don't know that I want to go into specific current events. I feel like that's controversial waters to wade into. But I also think I'm not an expert in those areas enough. Because I can speak with authority to the Jewish perspective, but these are medical questions. These are also questions of public policy. It's one of the things I love is that most hospitals have, as part of their ethics board, they have doctors and they have people that study ethics, and a lot of them have clergy involved as well. They have a mix of different minds, because I don't think these questions can be answered by a politician or by a doctor or by a clergy person alone. I think there's more knowledge than any one of us have the complete expertise to really be able to say this is the right thing to do.
I think that the guide in almost all cases like these is the Jewish medical ethics asks us to do everything we can to save as many people as possible. And I think that's where both your sources and my sources intersect, right? As long as we're doing everything we can to save as many people as we can, then we're headed in the right direction.
But what do you do with the not the case of Shiva ben Bikri, but the case of give us one of you or we'll kill all of you? Because the answer is unless one of them is selected specifically, or in your case, right, one of them's already sick, which was their selection.
Yeah.
How do you deal with something like that? How do you pick from a room of 10 random strangers one to die to save 9?
I hope I am never in my life faced with a scenario like that. I couldn't imagine anything more horrific. I don't know how to answer your question, but
I don't think there is an answer to that, but I'm just saying it's not always about saving as many. Our tradition, I think, does say, and that's where the deontological part of it gets in, that there are some times that giving up your own life is worth it. That there's sometimes that you don't want to be in that position. And again, I have never been in anything like that and hope I never would. So I don't know how to react. But it's like those stories and movies, right? Or TV shows. Well, if we give in and we do that, we'll be just like them, right? What kind of a life is it worth living when you have some things on your conscience? And I think it's a very tough decision. And I can't imagine and wouldn't blame, right, anybody in those positions. I could never imagine myself what I would do presented with that. But I think our tradition says that you don't choose someone. I really think it has a firm line there that that falls into the category of murder, and we don't do that.
and everybody should just die.
It's like the Ben Peturosaurus. Rather than see your other person die, I mean, there are things in life. I think, I don't know. I'm not a parent yet, but what I'm told is any parent would give up their own life for their child's life in a second, right? I'm assuming you would agree. I won't put you on the spot to ask you. But if a parent, I can imagine that situation where there are situations where one would rather give up their own life than live in a world knowing what they had done. And it's an awful choice to have to make. And I think our tradition's telling us that in some situations it's like that, rather than selecting another person to die. But that's a different situation than what you said, right? Where somebody is sick, somebody is going to die. And all we're doing is saying we're going to devote our limited resources to the person that has a long life ahead of them, not 3 months or 3 minutes.
Excellent point. So should we take some questions from
Sure.
chat?
Sure. I'll remove our spotlight so I can see everybody. Does anybody have any comments, or you want to do it right in the chat?
Len is asking, what about nurses refusing to go into nursing homes, knowing that it was a danger to their own lives? How does that relate to our discussion tonight? What do you think, Rabbi?
So we didn't bring those sources in, but our tradition actually has a lot to say about what do you have to risk for someone else's life. You have to take on financial risks to save someone's life, and you even have to take on a potential risk to your own life. Right? The sources are fairly clear. Again, this is where there's medical questions here, because I can't say how much risk there was going into those nursing homes, what kind of PPE they had.
That's called in halacha safek pikuach nefesh. You're saving somebody's life possibly by going in and taking care of them.
No, safek pikuach nefesh, but that there's a safek to your own life.
Yes.
Right? If I don't know how to swim and the water's really choppy, I have no obligation to jump into the ocean or the Lake Ontario and pull you out if it's a big storm and I'm not a good swimmer. But if I'm a very good swimmer and the lake's very calm, I do have an obligation, even though there's a risk by jumping in that I might get pulled into the riptide or whatever as well. I have to take a potential risk to my own life, as safek. So I think here, depending on how big that risk was to these nurses, they either were obligated or not.
Because it was a doubtful risk.
The question is, how big is that risk? And that's where I don't think rabbis can answer these questions alone.
The risk to the life of the long-term, the risk of the life of the long-term care patients, right? That their survival is also in doubt, right? A nurse may have said, well, come on, we'll leave them there for a few days, but they'll be okay. I'm not really consigning them to death by taking care of myself. You know, you can say that for the first few days, but not a week later. But it's interesting how the past year people have had to make real life decisions based on these moral questions.
Somebody asked, can that argument be used also as an argument for physician-assisted death or physician-induced death? I'm not sure exactly which argument, though, we were at that point in it. But I've definitely done that shiur before. I did it at Lunch and Learn in this last winter cohort. And it's a really interesting topic that I'd love to talk to people about, different Jewish sources.
Actually, no, that Rabbi Sachs, one of the sources that I've used before with regards to that question of physician-assisted death is the source that I brought forward that said that a life of a person who was terminally ill is not considered to be a nefesh, and to kill them is not to murder them.
Yeah.
Right? So it certainly opens up the door to thinking that somebody who is terminally ill is treated with regard to physician-assisted suicide very differently than somebody who, let's say, is healthy, otherwise healthy and maybe just depressed about life, or maybe is not terminally ill, but just severely ill. It's hard to know where to draw the line, but it would seem that if the Minchat Chinuch says, hey, if one of you is going to get killed, bring forward the terminally ill guy and it'll be okay, then one could also say that that's not murder if a person begs for death because they're in so much pain from a terminal illness.
It's one of those difficult distinctions, right? With this idea of the gnosis, the person who only has a couple of days left to live, versus the treifa, where they have up to a year left to live. And I think most of our sources deal with it in the category of gnosis, which actually has more rights than the treifa. Interesting, the person with the shorter time to live is the life you have to preserve. The treifa is the one that it's not murder to kill the treifa. Which is interesting, because that person has up to 12 months.
Explain to everybody why we're more concerned with the person who's at the end of their life.
I'll let you take that one, Rabbi.
Because we do not deny a person even the last moment to repent for any sins.
But that makes no sense, that it's not murder to kill someone with 10 months left to live. You're not worried about giving them a chance to repent for their sins. But the person with 2 days, you are worried about giving them.
It does make sense, Rabbi, because when you're faced with your own demise, it leads you to contemplate your life and perhaps to ask forgiveness. If you have a year to go, you deal with it later.
I'm thankful that I've never been in that situation, but I imagine if I was told I had less than a year to live, I would start having some serious conversations. But that's one of those issues of these difficult things and these different answers. And a lot of the interpretation, I think, has been through a certain perspective in a time and place, which I think some of what's going on with our conversation. I actually am on the outskirts of our movement when it comes to euthanasia, because I don't want to say I'm a fan. It's not the right word to describe it. But I think there's a strong argument to permit it. And all the sources that talk against it, they imagine where medical, keeping someone alive is days. Not that somebody could live on a ventilator for years, potentially, years with this. So I think that there's the sacred part, the part that is from Sinai about the value of life and the different considerations, but how it plays out in some of our literature, I think is very historical to a time and a place, and it's appropriate to reevaluate. See some more comments. I don't know how much time we have left there, Rabbi.
What about declaring your own status as do not resuscitate, DNR? That's actually easy from Jewish perspective because there's no rule that you have to go to extreme measures to save yourself. There is a rule that says once you have been saved, you're not allowed to unplug what is saving you. I think we can end the program tonight, Rabbi Sachs, by going back to what I said when I opened my class at the beginning of the discussion. I'm very aware, I don't know about you, Rabbi Sachs, but that we're talking about ethics and morals and debating these in the context of our homeland, whose ethics are being challenged now in a very severe way by the media and by many in the international community. And part of what I think Shavuot is about is appreciating that we come to all of these moral questions, maybe not with single answers. Rabbi Sachs and I purposefully did this session so you can see multiple perspectives in the Torah, real debate, the challenges of real life scenarios, but that we come at these questions with a great degree of seriousness. I'm not an expert on any other religion, but I can tell you that my experience with Judaism, what I've learned about Judaism, shows a great deal of sensitivity to all questions of the value of life, more than any other question that Jewish tradition deals with. And as I said, for people to question that from the outside, I think is a tremendous assault on Judaism's core values. We may disagree in how to handle difficult situations, but we certainly, I think, come at all of these questions with reverence for our obligation to see every person, whether they're Arab or Christian or Jewish, as created in God's image and worthy of being treated as such. So, like I said, Israel fights a physical war, but it fights a moral war. And all of us, I think, have an obligation to be soldiers in that moral war as well. speaking out for moral clarity, reminding people that we have a moral code that is deep and that is ancient and that still helps us to live our lives today. And what could be more appropriate, I think, on Shavuot?
Amen. I think that's such a great point. I think we've always been fighting that moral war, and every time and place being accused of all sorts of ridiculous nonsense and awful things. And our tradition just doesn't back that up. Our tradition, like you said, is very, very clear. So much so that it's not just the extent we go to save a life, but even just to protect someone from embarrassment, from having their dignity hurt, their self-esteem, their feelings hurt. That is treated in our tradition almost on the same level at times.
Right, to embarrass somebody is equivalent to murder.
We have such a high regard for not just human life, but human dignity and well-being that we have to do better PR. And I love what you said, that we all have to be fighting that fight and standing out there with our moral voice. It's almost like the prophets, a light unto the nations, because it's crazy to me how bad publicity we have as Jews when our tradition is so much the opposite of that. Can I make a pitch just for on YouTube? People can find, if you're looking for tomorrow or on Tuesday, our Yisker video, the service and a sermon from Rabbi Grover you can find on Beth Tikva's YouTube page. If you're
you are. And I'd like to also make a pitch for my adult ed class that's starting in 2 weeks on Monday mornings at a week after Victoria Day. We're going to be taking a look at a theme very closely related to what we discussed tonight called Pikuach Nefesh. Rabbi Sachs brought up the Jewish obligation to sacrifice laws in order to save somebody's life. It sounds simple, but it's actually rather complicated and controversial. So if you like these moral questions, it's going to be a class with a focus on Talmudic study on this question, and I hope you'll join us. Meanwhile, I want to wish you all, from our homes to your homes,
Sameach.
Don't eat too much cheesecake, and I hope that these next few days, most importantly, will bring peace in our homeland, peace between Jews and Muslims in Toronto. There's been a lot of damage what saddens me so much is that everything we've been trying to work on with our relationships with our Muslim brothers and sisters is just going down the drain, unfortunately, in the past few days. And I'm hoping that we'll have peace and restored and some important bridge building work to get started on once things quiet down.
Amen.
Shalom Yisrael. Take care, everybody. Hag Sameach.
Hag Sameach. Hag Sameach. Thanks for joining us.